Hello, the Pioneer viewers. As you know, our agenda is the Russia-Ukraine war. The developments and current situations during the war provide very important resources when analyzing the parties. One of the most important requirements for the state is legitimacy. The legitimacy of a state depends on the support and will of the people. Politicians should take into account the views of the people while governing the country. A movement without popular support has little chance of success. The only force that can sustain the human resources and production activities in the war is the people. While the one part of the country is busy with the war, the other part works to ensure its continuity. For these reasons, it is of utmost importance to have the uninterrupted support of the population, especially during the war. Russia has faced many problems following its invasion of Ukraine. Russia's methods of dealing with these problems is another problem. Russia excludes the public from political processes due to its authoritarian structure and closure to criticisms. The opinions of the civil society and large segments of the population do not carry any value for the Moscow administration. As the negative developments during the war processes began to reflect on the public, people want to react. The reactions of the people are suppressed in a short time. For these and the other reasons, the Russian public's support for the war in Ukraine has dropped to minimum levels. The surveys and the results were quite surprising. Let's examine the Russian public's decline in support for the war. As the Pioneer, we continue to report on the Russia-Ukraine war. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so that you don't miss our daily map reports and reports on the agenda. I also read all your comments on our videos. Please continue to share your ideas about our content in the comments with us. Let's start if you are ready. The Pioneer reports. Recently, Vladimir Putin, president of the Russian Federation, addressed the Russian People's Council. In his speech, he did not mention the ongoing war in Ukraine. In his address to the Russian people, he spoke about the patriotic feelings of Russians. He said that Moscow's leadership is fighting for the sovereignty and justice. Putin's speech was not taken into account by the Russian people. A serious position movement is rising in Russia. The Russian people's experiences during the war and the transitional periods have caused a public outcry. Russian people see the ongoing war in the Ukraine as Putin's war. According to the interviews with many Russian citizens, Russia's attempt to invade Ukraine is not accepted by the public. It is stated that the war does not benefit the Russian people. Ahead of the upcoming elections in Russia, many researchers are conducting public surveys. Ahead of the 2024 elections, economic difficulties are being felt in Russia. People are trying to struggle with great economic problems. The difficulties experienced by the people mean a loss of votes for Putin in elections. There are also problems with the Russian public support for the war. There are very few pro-war Russians, while there are many Russians who support peace. Russia has restricted laws that criminalize criticisms of the war. For this reason, the Russian people cannot openly voice their criticisms during the war. Those who criticize are punished with heavy penalties. In the early days of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russian public support for the war was higher than it is today. The Russian people live their lives under difficult conditions because of Moscow's actions during the war. The embargo and sanctions imposed on Russia have made life difficult for the Russian people. In the early days of the war, the support of the Russian people was high, but now only 12% of the Russian people support the war. Those who support the war do not want Putin to withdraw his troops without achieving military objectives. They think it is too early to start peace talks and that military spending should be the priority of the state budget. The segment of the Russian population that does not support the war is much larger. The vast majority of Russians do not support the invasion of Ukraine, which they characterize as Putin's war. A large majority supports the withdrawal of troops and peace talks without achieving military objectives. They also believe that budget priorities should focus on social spending, not military. The most important factor affecting the Russian public's support for the war is economic problems. Families in Russia are struggling to make ends meet. economic problems being with them psychological problems. The anxiety and fear that pervades the Russian people prevents them from being happy. The problems in Russia are affecting the living standards of the people very badly. Although Russian authorities are trying to fight economic problems, military expenditures magnify these problems. Russia is running out of time, as it is also having difficulties in dealing with military problems. As the winter increases its severity, the developments on the front line increases their importance. Winter conditions constitute the most critical days of war. The Ukrainian army has been preparing for winter for a long time. When fighting in winter, it is very important to preserve gains. In critical climate conditions, knowledge of the geography makes a great contribution. The senior officers' corps of the Ukrainian army prepares plans to take into account the seasonal conditions. Last year, the war evolved into a different dimension in winter. Taking the lesson from this, the Ukrainian army made early preparations for winter conditions this year. The Ukrainian army, which has strengthened trenches and troops, will continue its attacks against Russian targets throughout the winter. Focusing on depleting the sources of the Russian army and hitting its infrastructure and strategic points, the Ukrainian army is successfully implementing this strategy. It is known that the Ukrainian army wants to maintain its gains and make new gains by continuing in the same way throughout the winter. While the Ukrainian army continues its preparations and reinforcement efforts, the Russian army continues to suffer losses. In the statement made by the NATO Secretary General in the past days, Russian losses were mentioned. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that Russia has lost a large part of its conventional forces. The Russian army, which suffered heavy losses since the first days of the war, used its resources inefficiently. Commander inefficiencies in the Russian army also led to the irregular use of ammunition. As a result, there is currently a shortage of the ammunition and stocks in the Russian army. The fighting units of the Russian army often complain about the lack of equipment. The situation of the Ukrainian and the Russian armies is changing every day. Both sides are continuing their preparations according to their own plans. These are the last days before the coming colds and the snowy days. We will see that what will happen in the coming winter days. What do you think about the attitude of the Russian people toward the war? What do you think are the feelings of the Russian people during the war? What do you think about the Ukrainian army's winter preparations? What problem do you think they may arise on the front line as winter conditions become more difficult? We care about your opinion. Please share it with us.